Kelsey, Ryan, and Curtis Steele were supposed to be just temporary roommates. Two strangers Loretta Saunders let into her home to ease her rent burden. But within weeks, Loretta would vanish without a trace, and the very people she tried to help would become the prime suspects in a murder that shocked the nation. In early February 2025, the city of Halifax was deep in the grip of winter. Snow blanketed the streets, and the days were short and bitterly cold. Amid this frozen quiet, something unexpected and disturbing began to unfold. Loretta Saunders, a 27-year-old graduate student at St. Mary's University, suddenly disappeared. What started as a missed class soon became a chilling mystery that would shake her community and captivate the country. Loretta wasn't the kind of person to go off the radar. She was deeply committed to her work and had been researching missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada for her thesis. It was a subject rooted in both personal identity and purpose, one that consumed her academically and emotionally. An Inuk woman herself, Loretta understood the pain behind the statistics and stories, and she was determined to give voice to those who had been silenced. She had recently moved into a modest apartment in Halifax's West End. Life hadn't been easy balancing school, part-time jobs, and student loans, but she was focused. Her closest friends said she had grown even more serious in the final months leading up to her thesis deadline. Every day she followed a strict routine. Research in the morning, writing in the afternoon, and checking in with her family by phone or text at night. She wasn't the kind of person who disappeared without a word. When Loretta missed a scheduled meeting with her thesis advisor, it raised concern. But when she failed to return calls and messages from her sister for over 24 hours, her family knew something was wrong. They contacted police, who initially treated the case as a missing adult and nothing suspicious. They said just someone who might have needed time away. But Loretta's family pushed harder. They told the authorities this wasn't like her. Had plans, responsibilities, and more than anything, she had a strong sense of purpose. Walking away didn't fit who she was. 2 days later, a bigger clue emerged. Loretta's Cara, pale blue sedan was found abandoned near a quiet rest stop off the Trans-Canada Highway, just outside Moncton. The discovery felt eerie. The vehicle was unlocked, the windows rolled down despite the freezing cold, and Loretta's purse and phone were nowhere in sight. There was no sign of struggle, no clear trail of where she had gone. Just a single vehicle sitting quietly in the snow. Police brought in forensic teams to comb the car for evidence, but nothing obvious stood out. Her laptop bag was missing, and there were faint traces of mud in the back seat. Still, it wasn't enough to confirm foul play. That uncertainty, more than anything, filled the air with dread. Friends began sharing missing person posters online. Her photo, smiling, hopeful, was soon spread across social media with pleas for information. The mystery deepened each day. No one could understand why a woman so intelligent, focused, and rooted in her work would vanish into thin air. And as the cold days passed, one quiet question grew louder among everyone who knew her. What had happened to Loretta Saunders? As the search for Loretta Saunders intensified, investigators turned their focus to the last people who had seen her alive. Loretta had been subletting part of her 2-bedroom apartment to a couple she found through an online listing, Kelsey, Ryan, and Curtis Steele. They had moved in just a few weeks before she vanished. To most, they were an unremarkable pair. In their early 30s, unemployed and somewhat withdrawn, they kept to themselves and rarely interacted with neighbors. Loretta, known for her generosity and belief in second chances, had agreed to let them stay temporarily to help cover her rent. When police arrived at Loretta's apartment, something felt off. The door was locked, and her car wasn't in its usual spot. A neighbor mentioned that they hadn't seen Loretta in several days, but they did recall seeing Kelsey and Curtis moving around at odd hours, once even late at night, carrying what looked like a large rolled-up rug. With a warrant in hand, officers entered the apartment and quickly discovered that things were far from normal. The space looked as though someone had left in a hurry. Furniture had been moved, drawers were pulled open, and there was a strong chemical odor in the air. A bottle of bleach lay uncapped on the bathroom counter, and there were visible streaks along the walls and floor suggesting a hurried attempt to clean something. But the most unsettling discovery was a reddish-brown smear hidden behind the living room curtain rod. Forensic tests later confirmed it was blood. There was no sign of Loretta. The room appeared mostly untouched, though her laptop and phone were missing. The couple's bedroom, however, was half empty, with clothing and personal items thrown into garbage bags. It was clear Kelsey and Curtis had fled. A check of their records revealed a history of petty crime shoplifting, fraud, a few minor drug charges, but nothing violent. Still, the blood evidence, the cleaning supplies, and the fact that they had left town raised serious alarms. Investigators began tracing the couple's steps. Surveillance footage from the apartment building's underground parking garage revealed a key piece of evidence on the night Loretta went missing. Security cameras captured Kelsey and Curtis struggling to lift a heavy object wrapped in what appeared to be a rug. They placed it into the back of Loretta's car. Curtis drove out of the garage while Kelsey walked behind him, nervously glancing around. The timestamp on the footage aligned almost exactly with the last time Loretta had been seen or heard from. With this disturbing footage, police issued a Canada-wide alert for Kelsey Ryan and Curtis Steele. Their images were broadcast on news stations, and the public was asked to report any sightings. A missing persons case had suddenly shifted into something far more ominous. Loretta's family, overwhelmed with fear and grief, waited helplessly as the search expanded. What had started as a simple arrangement, a young woman helping to strangers in need, was now the center of a growing investigation. Each clue brought authorities closer to the horrifying possibility that Loretta hadn't just gone missing. She had been betrayed inside her own home. As the manhunt for Kelsey, Ryan, and Curtis Steele escalated, law enforcement agencies across multiple provinces joined efforts to locate the couple. With Loretta's car abandoned and no confirmed sightings of her, investigators feared the worst. The footage of Kelsey and Curtis loading what appeared to be a rug-wrapped body into the vehicle was now at the center of the case. It was no longer a missing persons investigation. It was now being treated as a probable homicide. Several days after the couple fled Halifax, a lead emerged from Ontario. A gas station attendant in Sudbury recognized the pair from a news broadcast. He told police that a pale blue sedan matching Loretta's had pulled in during the early morning hours. He remembered Kelsey acting jittery while Curtis cleaned the backseat windows with paper towels. Surveillance footage from the station confirmed the couple's identities. The license plate on the car matched Loretta's vehicle. The timestamp suggested they had already been on the road for more than 24 hours. Detectives feared that the longer Kelsey and Curtis remained free, the less chance there was of finding Loretta alive or finding her at all. Using data from traffic cameras, bank transactions, and toll booths, police slowly pieced together the couple's route. They had taken a winding path westward, avoiding major highways and sticking to rural backroads. At one point, they stopped at a pawn shop near Thunder Bay, where Curtis sold a piece of jewelry that later turned out to belong to Loretta. The net was closing in. Eventually, authorities tracked the couple to a rundown roadside motel outside Thunder Bay. A local tipster, who had recognized their photos on social media, spotted the blue car parked discreetly behind the building. Within hours, a team of officers surrounded the property. Kelsey and Curtis were arrested without resistance. Inside the motel room, investigators found disturbing clues: Loretta's student ID, her laptop, and a scarf stained with what would later be confirmed as her blood. There were also handwritten notes detailing a crude plan to flee to British Columbia and assume new identities. Despite the mounting evidence, Loretta herself was still missing. Interrogations began almost immediately. Curtis refused to speak, staring blankly ahead during questioning. Kelsey, on the other hand, changed her story several times. In one version, she claimed Loretta had left after an argument. In another, she suggested the death had been accidental. But the evidence told a different story, one of planning violence and a desperate attempt to cover up a crime. For Loretta's family, the arrest brought both relief and dread. They were grateful the suspects had been caught, but the absence of a body left them in painful limbo. Without Loretta, there were still no answers, only unanswered questions, and a growing sense of tragedy. Search efforts intensified around the couple's known travel route. Police combed forests, ditches, and rivers, hoping to find even the smallest trace of the young woman who had vanished into the cold Canadian landscape. 2 weeks after the arrest, just as public interest in the case began to wane, a quiet break came from an unlikely source. A local fisherman, checking his lines near a frozen creek off a remote highway in New Brunswick, noticed something unusual beneath the surface of the ice. At first, he thought it was just a bundle of discarded trash, half submerged and tangled in the weeds. But as he got closer, he saw that it had been tightly wrapped in plastic and secured with duct tape. Alarmed, he called the police. Within hours, investigators arrived and cordoned off the area. The bundle was carefully removed and thawed in a controlled environment. Inside was the body of Loretta Saunders. It was a moment both heartbreaking and necessary. Her family, who had been clinging to the last shreds of hope, finally had an answer. But the reality of it hit hard. She had not run away or gone missing by choice. She had been murdered and dumped like garbage in a shallow, icy stream. Autopsy confirmed what many feared. Loretta had died from blunt force trauma to the head. The wounds were consistent with a single object, used repeatedly and with force. There were no signs of defensive wounds, suggesting she had been caught off guard. Toxicology reports showed no drugs or alcohol in her system, meaning she had been sober and fully aware when the attack began. The medical examiner noted that the shape of the injuries matched a wooden table leg, an object missing from her apartment. Since the investigation began, this discovery provided the final piece of evidence prosecutors needed. Forensics had already confirmed Loretta's blood was found in her car, her apartment, and on the scarf recovered from the motel. Her personal items, including her laptop and ID, had been in the possession of the suspects. Now, with the recovery of her body and the confirmation of cause of death, the case became airtight. As investigators revisited the timeline, a chilling picture began to form. Kelsey and Curtis, facing financial struggles and behind on rent, had become increasingly desperate. Loretta had reportedly asked them to move out, giving them a deadline to vacate the apartment. Rather than leaving, they decided to take what they could and eliminate the person standing in their way. The attack had likely taken place in the living room late at night, while Loretta was unaware and unprotected. What made the case even more horrifying was the cold, methodical aftermath. The couple had wrapped her body in plastic, cleaned the apartment with bleach, and used her car to dispose of her remains hundreds of kilometers away. They then continued using the car, her bank cards, and even attempted to access her email in an effort to create the illusion that she was still alive. Their actions were not those of panicked people acting out of fear. They were calculated, deliberate, and cruel. The public reaction was one of outrage. Vigils were held across the country, and calls for justice grew louder. What had started as a missing persons case had now revealed a brutal murder fueled by selfishness and greed. Loretta's voice had been silenced, but the search for justice was just beginning. The trial of Kelsey Ryan and Curtis Steele began in the fall of 2025 at the Halifax Supreme Court. The courtroom was packed each day with reporters, students, activists, and members of Loretta Saunders' family and community. There was a quiet tension in the air, the kind that comes when grief and anger share the same space. The prosecution presented a case built on hard evidence, surveillance footage, forensic results, digital traces, and, most importantly, the recovered body of Loretta. Every detail painted the same picture. This was not a crime of passion or impulse, but a premeditated act carried out with disturbing intent. The defense attempted to argue diminished responsibility, claiming that both Kelsey and Curtis had suffered from long-term mental health issues and acted in a state of emotional distress. They portrayed the murder as a spontaneous reaction to conflict and stress. But their arguments fell flat against the mountain of evidence and the calculated steps the pair had taken after Loretta's death. The jury took less than 2 days to reach their verdict. Both were found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years, though justice had been served in the courtroom. For many, the loss of Loretta Saunders would never be healed by a sentence. She had been more than a student or a victim. She had been a rising voice for change. Her research on missing and murdered Indigenous women was deeply personal and painfully relevant. She had dedicated herself to telling the stories of those who were too often ignored or forgotten by society, never imagining she would become one of those stories herself. In the months that followed the trial, Loretta's thesis was posthumously completed and published with the help of her university advisor and classmates. It became a widely cited work in academic and activist circles, a rare moment where a voice taken too soon was still able to speak through the words she had left behind. Scholarships were established in her name. Community centers hosted awareness events. Politicians referenced her case when calling for reforms to better protect Indigenous women across Canada. Vigils were held not just in Halifax, but in major cities from coast to coast. Her photo, once seen on missing posters, was now held up in remembrance, often surrounded by candles, flowers, and red handprints, a symbol of the movement she had been part of. People who had never met her now carried her name with them, wearing it on shirts, sharing it in speeches, and writing it into legislation. Her family, though broken by loss, spoke often and publicly about Loretta's strength, her passion, and the legacy she left behind. They turned their grief into advocacy, continuing her mission by working with organizations that supported Indigenous families of missing and murdered women. They refused to let her death be just another statistic. In the end, Loretta Saunders' story did not end with her murder. It began there, sparking conversations, inspiring change, and reminding the world of the cost of silence. Her life, her work, and her voice would continue to echo far beyond the tragedy that tried to silence her.